On this lecture, you will learn about the Jamestown settlement and the Powhatan Wars. King James will be the English monarch from 1603 to 1625. Although Spain claimed all of North America under the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, James believed that England could encroach on the outskirts of Spain's New World Empire. As explained earlier, the first round of English colonization will be financed by joint stock companies. The first company to do this will be the Virginia Stock Company. The Virginia Stock Company was organized by London investors. And in 1606, it received a land grant from King James in order to establish English colonies in North America. Investors hoped to enrich themselves and strengthen England economically and politically. The investors hoped to find gold and silver as well as other valuable trading commodities in the New World, such as glass, iron, furs, tar, and anything else the country could supply. Since Jamestown was a for-profit seeking venture backed by investors, the colonies were all young men, mostly gentlemen, and they proved entirely unprepared for the challenges ahead. In April 1607, Englishmen aboard 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed 40 miles up the James River, named for the English king, in present-day Virginia, named for Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. 144 Englishmen arrived in Jamestown, and from the beginning, the settlers skirmished repeatedly with a group of Algonquin Indians who were part of the Powhatan Confederacy. The uninhabited peninsula they settled in was upriver and out of sight of Spanish patrols. It offered easy defense against ground assaults and was both uninhabited and located close to many Indian villages and their potentially lucrative trade networks. Thus, it made sense to settle there. It did not take long before the colonists built a fort. The fort demonstrated their awareness that they needed to protect themselves from Indians and Spaniards. However, despite their fears of a Spanish attack, the colonists' biggest threats were disease and starvation. The location of Jamestown was a disaster. Indians had ignored the peninsula for 2 reasons: terrible soil hampered agriculture, and brackish tidal water led to a debilitating disease. Despite these setbacks, Jamestown will be the first permanent English colony in the present-day United States. The leader of the colonists was John Smith. John Smith was the son of a yeoman farmer in England. Before Jamestown, he made his way to the Netherlands and joined a rebel army there, and engaged in fighting for independence from Spain. Then he hired himself to go on and fight the Ottoman Turks in Hungary. While in Hungary, he became a prisoner of war and was sold as a slave until he escaped and returned to England. In Jamestown, John Smith would take command as the colony began to fall apart. The colonists hoped for easy riches, but found none. As John Smith later complained, they would rather starve than work. And so they did. Disease and starvation ravaged the colonists, thanks in part to the peninsula's unhealthy location and the fact that supplies from England arrived sporadically or spoiled. Fewer than half of the original colonists survived the first 9 months. In 1607, as the colony was starving, John Smith proved himself skillful at securing food from the Virginian Indians. One day he was exploring the region in December of 1607 when he was captured by Chief Wahansenakawa's men. Chief Wahansenakawa, or Chief Powhatan as the English call him, was the leader of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. The story goes that when John Smith was captured, the chief wanted information, so he sent his less important daughter, Pocahontas, around 10 years old, to talk to him. One of the greatest stories that has captivated our historical imagination is the story that while in captivity, Chief Powhatan tried to execute John Smith, and Pocahontas saved him by throwing herself on top of him, halting the execution. However, this story is highly debatable. When John Smith was released, he does not mention the incident on his initial report. It will not be until his return to England and once he writes his memoirs about his adventures in the New World that John Smith mentions such incident. And on one account, he mentions being saved numerous times by numerous women. To be honest, if the event did happen, it was probably more of a ritualistic ceremony than an act of love by the young Pocahontas, as it has been portrayed in some accounts. What we are certain of is that the Powhatan kept the English alive that first winter. The Powhatan people rescued the weakened and demoralized English colonists by offering them corn. The Powhatan had welcomed the English and placed a high value on metal axe heads, kettles, tools, and guns, and eagerly traded furs and other abundant goods for them. With 10,000 Confederate natives and with food in abundance, the Indians had little to fear and much to gain from the isolated outposts of sick and dying Englishmen. But the colonists' use of violence against the Indians compelled the Powhatans to regard the English with suspicion. By September of 1607, more than half of the original 100 colonists were dead. By the following spring, only 38 were still alive. Smith's strong leadership helped the colony survive, but he also made enemies within the fort. As he slept in a boat in the river one night, Smith was badly injured by a mysterious gunpowder explosion. He returned to England for treatment in October 1609 and never set foot in Virginia again. As time went on, things continued to get worse for the colonists. 400 settlers arrived in 1609, but the overwhelmed colony entered a desperate starving time in the winter of 1609. Supplies were lost at sea, relations with the Indians deteriorated as more colonists began to take food by force. We would then have the First Anglo-Powhatan War that lasted around 4 years. The war was a series of skirmishes between the colonists and the Powhatan. In essence, it was a slow, burning war. As the relationship between the Powhatan deteriorated, disaster loomed the colony. Without supplies, the settlers ate everything they could, roaming the woods for nuts and berries. They boiled leather. They even ate excrement. Archaeological evidence shows that they butchered their dogs and cats. They dug up graves to eat the corpses of their former neighbors. One man was executed for killing and eating his wife. The following primary source explains. And one amongst the rest did kill his wife, powdered her, and had eaten part of her before it was known, for which he was executed, as he well deserved. Now whether she was better roasted, boiled, or carven out, I know not, but of such a ditch as powder wife I never heard of. This was a time which still to this day we call the starving time. It were too vile to say and scared to believe what we endured, but the occasion was our own. Archaeological excavations in 2012 exhumed the bones of a 14-year-old girl that show signs of cannibalism. Around 60 colonists will survive, and after the arrival of reinforcements in 1610, they will viciously attack the Powhatans. Using terror tactics borrowed from Queen Elizabeth's conquest of Ireland, English soldiers burned villages and towns and executed women and children. After 2 years, Captain Samuel Argall, the leader of the colonists, captured Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, in the spring of 1613 and turned his prisoner into the leverage necessary to make peace. While in captivity, Pocahontas was indoctrinated into the Anglican Church and baptized. Pocahontas may have been married prior to her kidnapping to an Indian named Cocoon in 1610. Nevertheless, while in captivity, Pocahontas married John Rolfe, an English colonist, most likely to form an alliance between the colonists and the Powhatans. Upon their marriage, John Rolfe mentioned that he married her for the good of the plantation, the honor of our country, for the glory of God, for my own salvation. Upon her marriage to John Rolfe, Pocahontas chose to take an English name, Rebecca, that means mother of two peoples, and they married in the large church inside James Fort on April 5th, 1614. After the marriage of Pocahontas and Rolfe, the tensions between the settlers and the Powhatans will lessen. Although not all scholars see the First Anglo-Powhatan War as a distinct conflict, at least from the Indians' perspective, many argue it to be England's first Indian War in America. Pocahontas and Rolfe will eventually have a son, Thomas. Thomas was born in Virginia in 1615. A year later, in 1616, the colony was in desperate need of more money from investors. So they sent Pocahontas, her husband John Rolfe, and their infant son to England to promote the colony. Pocahontas was referred to as Rebecca and was celebrated in the highest form by London society. She was also advertised as the civilized savage. As seen on this primary source, you can see how Pocahontas' features were changed to promote the idea. Unfortunately, as Pocahontas and Rolfe began their return to Virginia in March 1617, Pocahontas took ill as they set sail and died in England. She was 22 years old. The story of Pocahontas is one of those stories that has captivated our historical imagination over the years. However, often the historical narrative of Pocahontas' life is distorted, such as the portrayal of Pocahontas in the Disney movie Pocahontas. In the movie, Pocahontas falls in love with John Smith and saves him. Or she is often portrayed as a helpful child, willing to help the settlers, as shown in this children's book. But it is important to remember that her story was far more complex. It is also important to remember that we need to do a better job at accurately representing her story and the story of many other historical figures and events. So we can then fully understand our past and each other. Upon Powhatan's death, his brother Open-Shankono was made supreme chief. In 1618, the land in Virginia was abundant and cheap. Settlement was encouraged by the policy in which settlers who paid for their transportation to the Chesapeake received 50 acres of free land, termed a Headright. Moreover, Rolfe had recently introduced tobacco to the colony. Plantations were established up and down the James River, further encroaching on Indian land. As the population grew, the need for a more structured form of government became apparent, and in 1619, they established the House of Burgesses, the first legislative assembly in the American colonies. They first met July 30, 1619, with the governor, a council, and 22 burgesses representing 11 plantations or settlements. The burgesses were elected representatives. Only white men who owned a specific amount of property were eligible to vote for burgesses. As the population continued to grow in Jamestown, the Powhatan waited to see what to do with the ever-present settlement encroachment on their land. After Pocahontas' death, her father Powhatan died shortly after in 1618. Initially, the natives bought their time, but in 1622, Opechancanough launched an all-out assault on English settlers. Opechancanough led a series of coordinated surprise attacks that concentrated on settlements upriver from Jamestown and succeeded in killing nearly a third of the English population. What followed then was a 10-year war in which the English repeatedly attacked the Indian food supply. Peace finally arrived in 1632, but by then, the balance of power in Virginia had tipped toward the English. The colonial population had grown significantly, and Opechancanoug's power waned. Opechancanoug's uprising was so damaging to the colonists that it prompted a royal investigation of affairs in Virginia, which brought to light that the appalling mortality rate was caused more by disease and mismanagement than by Indian raids. The king revoked the Virginia Company's charter in 1624 and appointed a royal governor, but many of the features of local government established under the Virginia Company, including the House of Burgesses, remain intact. The Powhatans will try to stop English encroachment one last time in 1644, but by then Opechancanough was old and blind. Reports say that he had to have a servant open his eyes to see. The final assault that began in 1644 ended in 1646 with the capture of Opechancanough. Within 2 weeks, one of the English guards shot Opechancanough dead on the back. You will learn what happens next on the next lecture.